Now I would like to share with you more general numbers of the microgrid market. In fact, what is a microgrid market? What are the drivers behind? What money is involved and where should we put our money? And what is the forecast for the next few years over the continents or the countries? For that, I'm really proud to present to you our keynote speaker. He is working at the Guidehouse Insight for over 30 years, and he's the research director for the research team on the clean energy market. He has been focusing on the microgrid market with his research team for the last 10 years. So I can say he is the microgrid authority with all the numbers of the market today. We are talking to Peter Asmus from Guidehouse Insight directly from California. Peter, I hope you're in.
Yes, I am.
So, Peter, welcome here in the studio. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. It's still dark outside here in California. It's about 6 in the morning, but here I am.
Good. So, Peter, I heard you were preparing a microgrid yourself in your village. Is that true? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yes, as people have heard, we've had wildfires now. I believe this is the third or fourth year in a row. And we also had our own utility shutting off the power to sort of avoid future fires. So that has led me to work with local community stakeholders and philanthropists to build some microgrids locally. So we have one going in at the local water district, working on one for the local fire station and community center, also a little gas station in the next village, and several other projects in the area. So definitely a big topic here. We're all bracing for more fires, hopefully not too many big ones, but as you probably heard, this is a record-setting year in terms of the amount of fires so far.
Yes, it's absolutely something new. Because we were not 100% sure we could have a connection because of possible power outages, we have taken the opportunity to make your presentation earlier this week, and we took it on tape. For that reason, we're first going to look at your presentation on tape, and then we're going back to live to the studio with the questions.
Microgrids. Let's start with the fundamentals. What is a microgrid? Well, there actually are government definitions. The US federal government, as well as some international agencies, have definitions, but even when people hear those definitions, they're confused. So this simple diagram here sort of shows visually what a microgrid is: multiple distributed energy resources, multiple loads or demands on the system. But the key feature is this ability to separate from the larger grid what people call islanding, and therefore provide resiliency when the larger grid goes down. Now, there are remote microgrids which also operate where there is no grid, and the microgrid is the only source of power. So why microgrids today? Well, one of the main reasons on this slide shows that the growth in distributed energy resources is actually going to surpass the amount of energy coming online next year from centralized sources like coal plants and nuclear plants. And the gap between centralized and distributed continues to grow over time. So within about 10 years, there's almost twice as much of these smaller, smarter, cleaner resources coming online than the centralized resources. And what that means is we need to reconfigure the grid. We need to reinvent the grid. And microgrids are a key building block to make that happen, essentially. So, but what else for microgrids? What are the key drivers? Well, number one, as you may have heard, is reliability. The reliability of our grid, particularly here in the US, where I'm based, is going down, not up. And so we've had hurricanes, we've had wildfires, we've had all these things, but we've also had other issues that have made the grid more unreliable. Here's a few statistics. The U.S. Department of Energy estimates basically in the U.S. it's $150 billion a year lost due to power outages. And in 2018, that figure was actually double that, $300 billion. In California, where I live, we've had 1,500 power outages caused by the grid itself, causing fires, causing outages, and causing people to look for alternative solutions. The other key driver is that the cost of microgrids keeps going down because the two leading resources deployed in microgrids today, solar PV and energy storage, their costs keep going down. The solar PV costs have dropped 89% over the last decade, and lithium-ion batteries, which are the most popular batteries for microgrids, primarily because they're also used in EVs, they're used in your laptops, and because of Tesla really undergoing a major price-cutting campaign, those costs have dropped 80% over the last 5 years. So those things are making microgrids look more economically attractive. I already mentioned some of the other ones, disasters. We got climate change, we have terrorist attacks, earthquakes. Now we have COVID-19, which I just released a report, actually maybe hurts microgrids in the short term, but over the long run probably makes them even more attractive. But taking a look at disasters, where I live in California, I've actually had a fire recently operating nearby, and I've had 3 fires in the last 3 years, one also caused by the utility grid. So in 2020, here we are, we're only in September. We have 3 months to go in the wildfire season. We've had over 7,800 wildfires, and they have burned 1 billion acres. Last year, we had 7,860 wildfires, and the highest number was actually 2017, 9,270 wildfires. So, but it's not just the US. On the next slide here, I wanted to show Japan, because Japan was a pioneer in microgrids, but their grid was so reliable they didn't really commercialize the technology. But that's changing now. Within the last few years, they've had typhoons, snowstorms, earthquakes, floods, all of those things basically causing the grid to go down. And so they are in a transition from a centralized system. A lot of their nuclear power plants were put offline. There's some uncertainty as to what's going to happen in the future with that. But Japan is definitely moving into microgrids. Europe traditionally hasn't been a great microgrid market, in part, again, because the grid is reliable, but we're starting to see wildfires too. I believe there were wildfires in Sweden last year, as well as a few other areas. But in Japan here, let's look at that picture. You have trains underwater. You actually even have a solar system on fire, a floating solar system on water there on fire. So these are all the things that are wreaking havoc with business as usual. So what are the biggest market segments in microgrids? Here's some data from our Microgrid Deployment Tracker, the only global database that anyone is brave enough to publish. I say brave enough because the microgrid market is not very transparent. There is no government reporting of microgrids, generally speaking. And so we've been focused on collecting data on microgrids now for almost 10 years. We know it's not complete, but we're up to about 35 gigawatts of microgrids that we've identified specifically around the world. And here, if you look at the segments, the largest segment is remote. That's where microgrids began. In fact, if you said the word microgrids about 30 years ago, everyone thought you were talking about places where there was no grid. In places like Australia and Alaska in the US, that's where a lot of the innovation started. So remote is number one. This, you could sort of view this as cumulative identified capacity would be the best way to describe it. Number two is commercial and industrial. So 10 years ago when we started this, that was the smallest segment. Why was it the smallest? Well, microgrids were experimental. Businesses are very concerned about costs. They didn't want to take on risks. And so they were sort of slow to come around to microgrids. But now we actually see that so-called C&I microgrids, commercial and industrial, are the fastest growing market segment around the world. And I'll be talking a little more about that later. And then coming in third place are what we call utility distribution microgrids. These are microgrids actually deployed by utilities microgrids designed to serve the larger grid. And there you can see some of the other examples, including military, institutional campus. Well, direct current shows up as 0. That's a very interesting segment, though. Overlaps with some of the other ones, and that's a whole nother story. The actual microgrid market started with DC microgrids. In fact, the whole electric utility industry started with DC microgrids with Thomas Edison a long, long time ago. And there is some interest in that, moving in that direction as well. So let's go a little bit deeper into the remote segments, as well as some of the other segments that are going to be discussed later today. So remote island microgrids, this is the leading market in Europe. Canary Islands, Denmark, the island of Bornholm is one. That's actually a grid-connected system, over 100 megawatts. But you also have microgrids in the Mediterranean islands, off the coast of Portugal, and as well as in the UK. So the advantage of those microgrids is economy of scale. You have a relatively large island, and essentially if it's disconnected from the grid, it is a microgrid. So the advantage there is you can deploy a larger system, capture some economies of scale. Then we have military humanitarian microgrids. The US has definitely been the lead on the military microgrids, especially really creative mobile systems that can be deployed during combat situations. Like in Iraq and Afghanistan. And actually a lot of those systems evolve into humanitarian microgrids, because once the infrastructure is there, usually someone doesn't take it out. So once the conflict subsides, those systems are often transferred or become humanitarian microgrids. And as we'll hear, more and more countries are looking at microgrids, not necessarily for combat, but also for their bases, just to have resiliency to protect sensitive radar systems, etc. And then I already mentioned commercial and industrial systems. And these systems can be remote systems like mines. That's a big opportunity in Chile, South Africa, and Australia, as well as other parts of the world. But this is really where the focus is in the US today, including where I live in California, because the commercial industrial customers know what the cost is of an outage. They know how much money they lost. For example, in California, when the grid was shut down sometimes for 3 to 4 days purposely by the utility to avoid fires. And so they have an economic incentive to develop these microgrids. One of the challenges for microgrids is that most regulators don't value resiliency, the main benefit they provide. So absent that, they have to make an economic case in other ways. Now we're going to talk about a new trend, energy as a service. Here's a picture of Montgomery County. This is the whole idea that you don't have to put any money down. Another entity will pay for the microgrid, will guarantee a rate, and therefore you, in this case, a government facility gets a microgrid, and cost is not prohibitive. This is an idea that actually started in remote systems, like in Africa and India, with mobile money and pay-as-you-go. So that's all energy as a service. We see that now emerging as the #1 business model in the world. The second major trend, modular microgrids. Here's a little fire station in California. The idea of modular microgrids is they're also pre-configured, so you cut out a lot of the engineering costs and stuff, and so you can deploy them much more rapidly, which is becoming increasingly important. So where are these microgrids being deployed? Here is a market forecast that we recently finished. This is looking at the DERs, the distributed energy resources going into microgrids, and you can see it's a global market. Every region of the world is represented. Europe, by the end of the forecast, is still the smallest market. The largest is Asia Pacific, and North America comes in second. But you can see that also the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America regions are also microgrid markets. But how fast is this growing? This is a pretty phenomenal growth rate. Now, this is across all microgrid segments. 23.4% compounded annual growth rate. That's a very healthy market. And as I mentioned, we don't see COVID-19 really changing the long-term picture, just the short-term implementation. And how much is all this stuff worth? How much money can be made in microgrids? That's a question we get asked all the time at Guidehouse Insights. So here, this is the figure from that report. If you just look at the distributed energy resources, it's going to be a $30 billion market, almost $30 billion per year by 2029. So that's, well, some people might think that's a good market. I would argue it is. And that's undercounting the value of the market because that doesn't include the controls and some of the other investments. And that's going to be forecasted shortly before the end of the year. That's the next report I'm working on now. And then energy storage. It's really what's making microgrids viable, and it's not just microgrids, it's also other distributed energy platforms, is energy storage. 10 years ago, people were designing a microgrid to avoid energy storage because it was so expensive. Nowadays, I would estimate at least 75% of new microgrids coming online have some form of energy storage. And here you can see the growth, the market share of all the distributed energy, hydro, biomass, solar, wind, diesel, you name it. Storage is 18.7% of that market share today, but by the end of our forecast in 2029, it jumps to 37.5%. That's by far the largest leap of any particular technology. And energy storage is enabling. Here's a forecast just looking at the energy storage market. And just within that subset of microgrids, you can see by 2029, we're estimating that's a $10 billion a year market just for the storage devices that go into microgrids. And that includes flywheels. Paul will be happy to hear that, but also includes lithium-ion batteries, flow batteries, and different chemistries. I think that future microgrids might not just have one storage device, might have 2, even 3. So the future microgrid might have 4 generation sources, 3 storage sources, EVs plugged into it. It's going to become a multifaceted platform that can serve multiple purposes in multiple markets. And then even though energy storage is sort of driving the market, what's really going to make microgrids fully commercial, I like to say they're inching towards commercialization, are the digital controls. So that's the brains that make a microgrid work. This is a chart from what we call the Leaderboard Report. We're going to update this in the beginning of next year, and you can see there's large vendors in there, familiar vendors, General Electric, ABB, Schneider Electric, but there's also a lot of small vendors in there, Ncorp, Clean Spark, Spray, and so it's a mix of vendors. They're all interested in this market, and this is really the most exciting part of the market from a technology perspective, leveraging artificial intelligence, etc. So to summarize, microgrids are part of this emerging energy cloud. That's the term we use at Guidehouse for the future, integrating smart buildings, smart mobility, smart cities, and with microgrids and other forms of distributed energy management like virtual power plants, etc. So we're moving from a one-way to a two-way energy system. And so that's why you need to be part of the next big thing, microgrids.
So, welcome back in the studio live. Thank you, Peter, for your presentation.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. So, for the audience, be aware that for the next few minutes, I've got some questions for Peter, and that's giving you the time to send in all the questions and commands you want to ask to Peter as well. I'll come back on that later. And also be aware that if the slides went too fast for you, that can happen. These slides will be made available as well as the whole webinar, I guess from tomorrow on. So you can look at it back. So Peter, I've got a first question for you. You've been researching this energy market, so a little bit larger than only the microgrid market, for decades. And could you explain to us what exactly is the change in time we're witnessing now? What do we see?
Well, I think what we see is a lot of the assumptions about energy that drove electricity sort of design for the last 100 years are changing so rapidly that's why we need things like microgrids. I mentioned sort of the numbers with distributed energy resources. If you look at all the past forecasts on solar PV, they were all wrong. I just looked at a forecast where big institutions predicted renewable energy. We weren't going to meet certain levels by something like 2057, and we hit those levels in 2017. So change is happening more and more rapidly, and microgrids are part of that, and they were going to become necessary because as we add all of this smaller stuff, you're going to need ways to organize it, optimize it. And so that's why microgrids are so important in the future.
Okay.
And today.
And you explained to us in your presentation that microgrids, especially in your presentation, are more focused on power. But we also have the discussion that microgrids can be far more broad. Then we're talking about maybe mobility or hydrogen or heat or whatsoever. Could you explain us the choices you made in your presentation?
Yes, well, I think this shows that the bias in the energy industry is still towards thinking of things as supply. So when people report how big is your microgrid, they generally will talk about the peak capacity. Now, you could talk about the load served, but actually, if you look at it from an investment perspective, it's the peak capacity. That's what has to be invested to meet that demand at all times. And so that's why historically everyone has sort of sized a microgrid according to electrical capacity. But you're right, particularly with remote microgrids, the largest segment, they could be a source of clean water, heat, and even with grid-connected systems now, they're linked to clean mobility, where those EVs then become a resource for the microgrid to back up electricity. And so it's going to become a multifaceted. So the microgrid platform can be as broad as you want to make it. And that seems to be the direction. But if someone still asks you, how big is your microgrid? Nearly everyone will say, oh, it's 5 megawatts. And that's a measure of the peak capacity.
Okay.
Electrical capacity.
Yeah, I understand. So you explained with the main players also in the microgrid market. But could you also explain to us who are the main customers?
Well, I did show some of the different segments, and those segments are pretty broad. As I mentioned, we're now seeing business, private sector market really starting to take off. And there are reasons, as I mentioned, one in a place like California where there have been a lot of power outages, they can say, hey, I lost $700,000 in the last 4-day outage or whatever, I need to invest to keep my business going. So that's one aspect of it. But the other thing is people want more resilience. Sometimes they think their utility might not be moving fast enough. Maybe even the regulators aren't moving fast enough. So that's the other thing about a microgrid is you can just kind of customize your own system. And if you say, I like solar, or maybe you like wind, and you have wind in the site, you can then create a personalized system, just like we have personalized entertainment, personalized phone services. You could say microgrids are just another reflection of that trend.
Okay, thank you. I saw in your presentation you gave an overview of microgrids over the continents. And I saw in your presentation that particularly Europe is lagging behind in its exploitation of deployment effect of microgrids. Could you explain us why that is?
Well, it's interesting. There's a blog coming out today on that topic. I was trying to get it out before the conference, but I know it's coming out today. But Paul kind of hinted on some of this. So one is the European grid traditionally has been one of the most reliable, if not the most reliable, although one said that about Japan too. And as I noted, that's starting to change. So one is the reliability. A lot of it is the way renewables are developed in Europe with typically a feed-in tariff. So the power is more, it's more about maximizing your local production, sending it upstream, where if you think about it, that's the opposite of a microgrid perspective, which is sealing yourself off from the larger grid and islanding. And in some ways, if you already had a feed-in tariff in place, you would violate that contract. Now, you can create feed-in tariffs on an island, and that would be supportive of a microgrid. But that's one of the challenges. It's mainly about power outages, but I believe that Europe is focused mainly on these remote islands. I do think that there's going to be a shift, and there were wildfires, as I mentioned. There's going to be extreme weather, climate change, and I believe that Europe will be a viable market. But today, it's still mainly these islands I mentioned in my presentation.
Wow, thank you. Now we're going to talk about costs. So what can we expect to be the cost of the power from microgrids today and also in future, if we compare it with the current situation?
Well, that's a question. I remember someone asked me that in the very beginning, and it's, the answer is always, it depends, which people hate. But it's true. The problem with a microgrid generalizing is they can be 20 kilowatts in size, 100 megawatts in size. They could just have a combined heat and power source. They could have solar batteries, tidal, hydrokinetic, different kinds of batteries. But we have done cost studies and looked at sort of average costs. And I would say it still varies. I remember, I think a study we did for the California Energy Commission was around $3 million per megawatt was sort of one average cost. But those costs are coming down as solar comes down, storage comes down. So it's really about how do you compare to the utility? And I would say there are microgrids today that can provide lower cost energy and resiliency compared to the utility. In the US, that's the Northeast and California, where we have high retail costs. It's going to be harder to do in, let's say, Chicago or some other places. But you can do a cost-effective microgrid today with the right mix of resources in the right locations.
I think that's really important for us to learn that. I would like to address another topic. So today we see that COVID is really shaking our world. What impact do you foresee from COVID on these developments?
Yes, we just released a short report on that topic. What I've heard, and I interviewed a lot of vendors, most say that COVID-19 did slow things down this year, and some argue it might even have a more greater impact next year. In my forecast, we did assume a downgrade of installations in 2020, roughly across the board between 10 and 20%, depending on the market segments. The report I did was actually looking at market segments. So some are benefiting immediately. Healthcare, for one, especially rural kind of hospital type microgrids where there's some government or NGO support. Data centers now, because of the stock is going up of all the Facebooks, Googles, et cetera, but they have had so much demand that they're starting to think more about microgrids themselves. And so those are two segments that benefit. One segment that's being hurt is hospitality, hotels. Obviously not a lot of people going to hotels because of COVID-19. And so that's a market that was just starting to pick up. Premium real estate companies thinking about not wanting to just burn diesel for their high-end customers, et cetera. So it's a mixed bag, but over the long run, I believe it'll actually benefit microgrids because it's just another emergency. It's putting people in this thought of extreme weather, unknowns. I need to have a more reliable system and a more sustainable system.
I've got a last question for you before I go to the questions of you, audience. And that is, what is, in your eyes, the essential value of a microgrid now, today? Or is there a better alternative?
Well, I would also say some people say they want a microgrid. And then when you really dig into what they want, maybe they don't need a microgrid. So there is a certain hype about these things, just like IoT, artificial intelligence. I mean, these are all brilliant advances, but they can sometimes be a little overhyped. But I would say a microgrid the beauty of the microgrid is it can serve multiple purposes. But number one will be resiliency, because that's the differentiator compared to a virtual power plant or some of these other concepts. You need to have power. If you need power for whatever reason, for health reasons, for economics, et cetera. And then two, though, it helps you integrate renewables and move away from backup diesels, which has been the default solution. And then three, they can actually save you money, and they can even be a good neighbor to the grid by providing grid services. So that latter part, the grid services, is more of a longer term play, but that's what will make utilities less opposed to microgrids. There is still some resistance among utilities. They like to control things in their grids. And so these microgrids sort of can be viewed as a challenge. But that is changing, and more utilities. Also in Europe, there are microgrids being deployed by E.ON and some other utilities in Sweden and other parts of Europe. So utilities in Europe are beginning to look into this as well.
Sounds like a great combination. So now it's time to move to Michael, and I'm very curious, what questions come from the audience today? Michael.
Hey, hi, nice to meet you, Peter. It's really great to have you here. One of the questions that keep coming up that actually a lot of people are liking here is whether or not microgrids have or pose a clear advantage to the transition to a cleaner energy source, to clean energy.
That's a good question. Peter.
Yes, well, that's related to what I was just talking about, is that even in Europe, which has climate reduction targets, as does California, people still tend to be attached to diesel generators because they've been around a long time. That's been the traditional solutions. The beauty of a microgrid, though, is those backup diesel generators are assets that just sit there most of the time when there's not an outage. The beauty of the microgrid is you could have cleaner resources, and you can rely on those cleaner resources for backup power. But when the grid is operating, that microgrid can be sort of a gateway to services going back and forth. You can import cheaper, clean power from the utility when that's available. Maybe there's too much wind power on the grid because of offshore wind. At certain times, you could import that to your microgrid. Then at some times, maybe the wind dies down suddenly and you need to call upon other resources, and those microgrids, if there is a market available to allow them to do that, could then provide power. So in terms of data centers, I mentioned most data centers still have all this diesel stuff. They will offset those emissions by buying credits from wind farms, but wouldn't it be smarter if they just had cleaner assets, and therefore those wind farms would just provide value? You wouldn't be offsetting what you have on site. Your on-site sources would be cleaner. So those are just a few examples.
Thanks for that, Peter. Really clear. Back to you.
What other questions do you have?
Oh, we've got so many questions. It's hard to choose actually which ones to jump in. But
the easy ones. Just
the easy ones. What is your name? No. One great question that I see a lot of people respond to here is, there's really clear advantages of microgrids. You just mentioned one of them. Another one is, what are the main challenges that face the microgrid community for its full adoption worldwide? What do you think that might be?
Well, I don't want to keep talking about California, but it is such a hotspot. So I will say that I recently talked to a vendor who gave California an F in terms of its approach to microgrid. So I don't know if I'd be quite that harsh. But the challenge is more interconnecting with the larger grid. There's sometimes still, it's not streamlined enough. And that's one reason we're seeing these modular microgrids come out, microgrid in a box. So it's more easier to plug them in. So on one hand, the personalization of a microgrid is a plus, generally speaking, but it can be a minus if that's going to take you over a year to design it, to be customized, and then try to get it interconnected and all those kinds of things. And so a lot of it is that the grid it wasn't set up really for microgrids. I mean, it started with microgrids, and then we grew to this huge system, centralized long distance transmission. And now we're going back to where we began. And so it's that transition that's a little rough. But I always like to say I'm an optimist that in general, the rules are looking better and better for microgrids. It's just a matter of, it's very patchy. You know, in the US, we have 50 different states. In Europe, you have all these different countries. Each one has a slightly different policy. At least in Europe, there's an EU framework, and that's what's helped things. But that's the challenge. It's really the nitty-gritty part of interconnecting with the utility that's one of the bottlenecks today.
Cool. Thanks so much for your feedback. These people are eating it up, so it's really great to hear.
Do you have other questions from the audience?
We have tons, but I think we can always park them a little bit and come back to them later. Or if you want, we can field one last one.
The last one?
One last question. Arnold actually asks whether or not you see microgrids emerging from network operators, or is this something that will come from the wider local small business community? Who's going to be playing the bigger role here in the growth and development of the microgrid community?
Well, what I would say is that network operators and utilities are becoming more interested in microgrids, whereas 10 years ago when I started, many were hostile to microgrids or questioned whether they really work, were they safe? That is one of the issues utilities worry about, which I did mention is, you know, this, if it's a private system, it's interacting with my grid, how's it going to impact me? And will it just be benefits for that private party, or is there a bi-directional exchange? So I see it as the private sector is driving the innovation, and it's this energy as a service concept where the customer might not have to put any money down. That's what accelerated solar in the US, rooftop solar for residents, are all these companies coming in saying, you don't have to put any money down, we're going to guarantee you a rate, we'll own the system, etc. So now that's starting to happen with microgrids, and that's really going to accelerate growth with business customers in particular.
Nice.
Well,
Back to
thank
you,
you,
Margie.
Michael. Yeah. I still have 2 questions for you, Peter. You
That doesn't surprise me.
No, I just want to learn more from you. So you showed us in your presentation the forecast of the future. And of course, I'm really, really interested in that. You showed us about the volume of storage, but also about the amount of money which is going on for the next few years in microgrids. This is a type of forecasting you used to use with Guidehouse Insights, but I'm always interested in scenarios. Could you explain to us what insecurities or what other scenarios could be possible? So could it be twice as much or half of it? And influenced by what factors? Could you explain that to us?
Yes, we used to do more multiple scenarios, and actually I'm an advocate of that. But quite frankly, it was more now kind of a corporate decision for our reports, because otherwise the reports can be so big and take so long to develop. So part of it's just sort of a practical strategy. So the forecast we present, we would call our base scenario, or best guess, I guess you could call it, is another one. I mean, it's more than a guess. And then we used to do an aggressive and conservative. So I would say that the upside is more a forecast higher than what I'm predicting is more probable than a forecast lower than what I'm presenting, but that varies by region and market segment. So for example, my European forecast was still relatively modest, but let's just say climate change keeps accelerating. There's a major power outage somewhere in Europe that impacts the mainland. That could be a driver, just like now the wildfires in California 3-4 years ago is sort of accelerating. Our governor just announced this week that he wants to accelerate the transition to clean energy. So, these are events that we cannot forecast, but, earthquakes, all of these sort of weather events, but there's also terrorist attacks. So a lot of the drivers, not too long ago, there was a more emphasis on terrorist attacks. Now it seems like lately, thank God, we haven't had as many major events, but that could also be another reason why people will look for microgrids. A terrorist attack on the grid, critical infrastructure, would reveal how vulnerable it is. So our factors are cost driven, looking at policies, And like I said, the scenarios, you could do 3 scenarios for each country if you wanted to go that granular. And sometimes clients ask us to go that deep. But for our syndicated reports for general rating, that's what we generally do is we present the base scenario, which is basically our best.
Yeah. One of the other questions I had is that there are different stakeholders involved with microgrids. And you explained something about the industry, also about the type of customers. So what role do investors play in these, and also particularly governments with their, how are they looking at it and how are they influencing the developments?
Well, government has played a big role, especially in the beginning. I mean, when we first looked at the microgrids in the world 10 years ago, I would say it seemed like, I'd say over half of the microgrids, especially in grid-connected environments, had some government support and government programs. There have been a lot of programs in Europe, even though there aren't a lot of microgrids in Europe per se. A lot of the vendors, ABB, Siemens, Schneider Electric, a lot of these big technology companies sell into a global microgrid market. And there's a lot of research institutes in Germany, in Denmark, in the UK that have focused research and EU programs to look at microgrids. So that is, that is important. But the private, I would say right now, the more interesting part are the role of private investors. And so in the last 2 years, we've had major investors come to us, and probably the biggest announcement in terms of a major investor in the US is the Carlyle Group. Big money. They dedicated, I believe, $500 million to microgrids, and I believe they just announced a new venture, the Schneider Electric, to partner with other investors on this energy as a service type platform. You have oil companies like Total buying up microgrid companies. You have EDF involved. You have lots of major European utilities deregulated, also buying up companies in the microgrid space. Primarily, the Europeans focus on Africa for off-grid systems. That's what they see as their near-term opportunity, but they are positioning themselves for a global market. And so, in my view, the most interesting thing is the private sector investment going on. The government funding is great, but there's definitely a shift to private money.
Great. Well, thank you. Final question. What is your question for the audience?
Well, since this is mainly a European conference, how can we accelerate microgrid deployments actually in Europe itself? And I suppose particularly in not just on the islands, but in the mainland, like in Germany, France, the Netherlands. I know there've been some experiments. So, what can you do to make Europe a bigger microgrid player? That's my question.